Welcome back to Sleepbound. Tonight's chapter of the Neverending Story is a turning point. Bastian, lost and alone, begins a desperate search for home. But the way back isn't simple. He wanders through the strange and eerie city of old emperors, where forgotten rulers live in endless confusion, and sails across the sea of mist, losing pieces of himself along the way. What happens when the wishes run out? Settle in, close your eyes, and let's drift into the story. While Bastian was racing through the pitch-black night miles ahead, his companions were still making preparations for departure. Most were exhausted, and none had anything approaching Bastian's strength and endurance. Even the armored giants on their metallic horses had a hard time getting started, and the footsloggers couldn't manage to fall into their mechanical tramp, tramp, tramp. Zayed's will, which moved them, seemed to have reached the limits of its power. Her coral litter had been devoured by flames. A new conveyance had been built out of shattered weapons and charred planks from the ivory tower, but it looked more like a gypsy wagon than a litter. The rest of the army hobbled and shuffled along as best they could. Even Hycrian, Hisbald, and Hydorn, who had lost their horses, had to hold one another up. No one spoke, but they all knew they would never be able to overtake Bastian. On he galloped through the darkness, his black mantle flapping wildly in the wind, the metallic limbs of his gigantic horse creaking and grinding at every movement as the great hooves pounded the earth. "Gee up!" cried Bastian. "Gee up! Gee up!" The horse wasn't running fast enough for him. He was determined to overtake Atreyu and Falkor at all costs, even if it meant riding this metallic monster to its death. He wanted vengeance. He would have attained the goal of all his wishes if Atreyu hadn't interfered. Bastian had not become Emperor of Fantastica, and for that, he would make Atreyu repent. The joints of Bastian's metallic steed ground and creaked louder and louder, but still, it obeyed its rider's will. Bastian rode for hours and hours through the endless night. In his mind's eye, he saw the flaming ivory tower. Over and over, he lived the moment when Atreyu had set the point of his sword to his chest. And then, for the first time, he asked himself why Atreyu had hesitated. Why, after all that had happened, couldn't he bring himself to strike Bastian and take Aran by force? And suddenly, Bastian thought of the wound he had inflicted on Atreyu, and the look in Atreyu's eyes as he staggered and fell. Bastian put Secanda, which up until then he had been clutching in his fist, back into its rusty sheath. In the first light of dawn, he saw he was on a heath. Dark clumps of juniper suggested motionless groups of gigantic, hooded monks, or magicians with pointed hats. And then suddenly, in the midst of a frantic gallop, Bastian's metal steed burst into pieces. Bastian lay stunned by the violence of his fall. When he finally picked himself up and rubbed his bruised limbs, he found himself in the middle of a juniper bush. He crawled out into the open. The fragments of the horse lay scattered all about, as though an equestrian monument had exploded. Bastian stood up, threw his black mantle over his shoulders, and with no idea where he was going, started walking in the direction of the rising sun. But a glittering object was left behind in the juniper bush. The belt Gemahl. Bastian was unaware of his loss and never thought of the belt again. Ilwan had saved it from the flames for nothing. A few days later, Gemahl was found by a blackbird, who had no suspicion of what this glittering object might be. She carried it to her nest, but that's the beginning of another story that shall be told another time. At midday, Bastian came to a high earthen wall that cut across the heath. He climbed to the top of it. Behind it, in a crater-like hollow, lay a city. At least the quantity of buildings made Bastian think of a city, but it was certainly the weirdest one he had ever seen. The buildings seemed to be jumbled every which way without rhyme or reason, as though they had been emptied at random out of a giant sack. There were neither streets nor squares, nor was there any recognizable order. And the buildings themselves were crazy. They had front doors in their roofs, stairways which were quite inaccessible and ended in the middle of nowhere. Towers slanted, balconies dangled vertically. There were doors where one would have expected windows, and floors in the place of walls. Bridges stopped halfway, as though the builders had suddenly forgotten what they were doing. There were towers bent like bananas and pyramids standing on their tips. In short, the whole city seemed to have gone mad. Then Bastian saw the inhabitants, men, women, and children. They were built like ordinary human beings, but dressed as if they had lost the power to distinguish between clothing and objects intended for other purposes. On their heads, they wore lampshades, sand pails, soup bowls, waste paper baskets, or shoe boxes. Their bodies were swathed in towels, carpets, big sheets of wrapping paper, or barrels. Many were pushing or pulling handcarts with all sorts of junk piled up on them: broken lamps, mattresses, dishes, rags, and knickknacks. Others were carrying enormous bales slung over their shoulders. The farther Bastian went into the city, the thicker became the crowd. But none of the people seemed to know where they were going. Several times Bastian saw someone dragging a heavily laden cart in one direction, then, after a short time, doubling back, and a few minutes later changing direction again. Everybody was feverishly active. Bastian decided to speak to one of these people. "What's the name of this place?" The person let go his cart, straightened up, and scratched his head for a while as though thinking it over. Then he went away, abandoning his cart, which he seemed to have forgotten. But a few minutes later, a woman took hold of the cart and started off with it. Bastian asked her if the junk was hers. The woman stood for a while, deep in thought. Then she too went away. Bastian tried a few more times but received no answer. Suddenly, he heard someone giggling. "No point in asking them," said the giggler. "They can't tell you anything. One might, in a manner of speaking, call them the know-nothings." Bastian turned toward the voice and saw a little gray monkey sitting on a window ledge, or rather, on what would have been a window ledge if the window hadn't been upside down. The animal was wearing a mortarboard with a dangling tassel and seemed to be busy counting something on his fingers and toes. When he had finished, he grinned and said, "Sorry to keep you waiting, sir, but there was something I had to figure out." "Who are you?" Bastian asked. "My name is Argax," said the little monkey, lifting his mortarboard. "Pleased to meet you. And with whom have I the pleasure?" "My name is Bastian Balthazar Bucks." "Just as I thought," said the monkey, visibly pleased. "And what is the name of this city?" Bastian inquired. "It hasn't actually got a name," said Argax, "but one might, in a manner of speaking, call it the city of the old emperors." "Old emperors?" Bastian repeated with consternation. "Why, I don't see anybody who looks like an old emperor." "You don't?" said the monkey with a giggle. "Well, believe it or not, all the people you've seen were emperors of Fantastica in their time, or wanted to be." Bastian was aghast. "How do you know that, Argax?" The monkey lifted his mortarboard and grinned. I, in a manner of speaking, am the superintendent here. Bastian looked around. Not far away, an old man had dug a pit. He put a lighted candle into it, then shoveled earth over the candle. The monkey giggled. What would you say to a little tour of the town, sir, to get acquainted in a manner of speaking with your future residents? No, said Bastian. What are you talking about? The monkey jumped up on his shoulder. Let's go, he whispered. It's free of charge. You've already paid the admission fee. Bastian obeyed the monkey's orders, though he would rather have run away. He grew more miserable with every step. He watched the people and was struck by the fact that they didn't talk. They were all so busy with their own concerns that they didn't even seem to see one another. What's wrong with them? Bastian asked. Why are they so odd? Nothing odd about them, said Argax. They're just like you, in a manner of speaking, or rather, they were in their time. Bastian stopped in his tracks. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that they're humans? Argax jumped up and down on Bastian's shoulder. Exactly, he said gleefully. Bastian saw a woman in the middle of the street trying to spear peas with a darning needle. How did they get here? What are they doing here? Oh, there have always been humans who couldn't find their way back to their world, Argax explained. First, they didn't want to, and now, in a manner of speaking, they can't. Bastian looked at a little girl who was struggling to push a doll's carriage with square wheels. Why can't they? He asked. They'd have to wish it, and they've stopped wishing. They used up their last wish for something else. Their last wish? Said Bastian, going deathly pale. Can't a person go on wishing as long as he pleases? Argax giggled again. Then he tried to take off Bastian's turban and pick lice out of his hair. Stop that! Bastian cried. He tried to shake the little monkey off, but Argax held on tight and squealed with pleasure. No, no, he chattered. You can only wish as long as you remember your world. These people here used up all their memories. Without a past, you can't have a future. That's why they don't get older. Just look at them. Would you believe that some of them have been here 1,000 years and more, but they stay just as they are? Nothing can change for them, because they themselves can't change anymore. Bastian watched a man who had lathered a mirror and was starting to shave it. Once that might have struck him as funny. Now it made him break out in gooseflesh. He hurried on and soon realized that he was going deeper into the city. He wanted to turn back, but something drew him onward like a magnet. He began to run and tried to get rid of the bothersome gray monkey, but Argax clung fast and even spurred him on. Faster, faster. Bastian stopped running. He realized that he couldn't escape. You mean, he asked, gasping for breath, that all these people here were once emperors of Fantastica, or wanted to be? That's it, said Argax. All the ones who can't find their way back try sooner or later to become emperor. They didn't all make it, but they all tried. That's why there are two kinds of fools here, though the result, in a manner of speaking, is the same. What two kinds? Tell me, Argax. I have to know. Easy does it, said the monkey, giggling as he tightened his grip on Bastian's neck. The one kind gradually used up their memories, and when they had lost the last one, Orin couldn't fulfill their wishes anymore. After that, they came here, in a manner of speaking, automatically. The others, the ones who crowned themselves emperor, lost all their memories at one stroke. So the same thing happened. Orin men couldn't fulfill their wishes anymore, because they had none left. As you see, it comes to the same thing. Here they are, and they can't get away. Do you mean that they all had Orin at one time? Naturally, said Argax, but they forgot it long ago, and it wouldn't help them any more, the poor fools. Was it? Bastian hesitated. Was it taken away from them? No, said Argax. When someone crowns himself emperor, it simply vanishes. Obviously, because how, in a manner of speaking, can you use Moonchild's power to take her power away from her? Bastian felt wretched. He would have liked to sit down somewhere, but the little gray monkey wouldn't let him. No, our tour isn't done yet. The best is yet to come. Keep moving. Bastian saw a boy with a heavy hammer trying to drive nails into a pair of socks. A fat man was trying to paste postage stamps on soap bubbles. They kept bursting, but he went on blowing new ones. Look! Bastian heard the giggling voice of Argax and felt his head being twisted by the monkey's little hands. Look over there, it's so amusing. Bastian saw a large group of people, men and women, young and old, all in the strangest clothes. They didn't speak. Each one was alone with himself. On the ground lay a large number of cubes, and there were letters on all 6 sides of the cubes. The people kept jumbling the cubes, and then staring at them. What are they doing? Bastian whispered. What sort of game is that? It's called the jumble game, answered Argax. He motioned to the players and cried out, Good work, children. Keep at it. Don't give up. Then, turning back to Bastian, he whispered in his ear, They can't talk anymore. They've lost the power of speech. So I thought up this game for them. As you see, it keeps them busy. It's very simple. If you stop to think about it, you'll have to admit that all the stories in the world consist essentially of 26 letters. The letters are always the same, only the arrangement varies. From letters, words are formed. From words, sentences. From sentences, chapters. And from chapters, stories. Now take a look. What do you see there? Bastian looked. At first, it seemed like complete nonsense. Letters scattered without meaning, shifting and swirling on the page. Yes, of course, said Argax with a giggle. It usually makes no more sense than that, but if you keep at it for a long time, words turn up now and then. Not very brilliant words, but still words. Spinach cramp, for instance, or sugar brush, or nose polish. And if you play for 100 years, or 1,000, or 100,000, the law of chances tells us that a poem will probably come out. And if you play it forever, every possible poem and every possible story will have to come out. In fact, every story about a story, and even this story about the 2 of us chatting here. It's only logical, don't you think? It's horrible, said Bastian. I wouldn't say that, said Argax. It depends on your point of view. It keeps these people, in a manner of speaking, busy. And anyway, what else can we do with them in Fantastica? For a long time, Bastian watched the players in silence. Then he asked, under his breath, Argax, you know who I am, don't you? Of course I do. Is there anyone in Fantastica who doesn't? Tell me one thing, Argax. If I had become emperor yesterday, would I already be here now? Today or tomorrow, said the monkey. Or next week. One way or another, you'd have ended up here. Then Atreyu saved me? You've got me there, the monkey admitted. But if he had succeeded in taking the gem away from me, what would have happened then? The monkey giggled again. You'd have ended up here, in a manner of speaking all the same. Why? Because you need Oren to find the way back. But frankly, I don't believe you'll make it. The monkey clapped his little hands, lifted his mortarboard, and grinned. Tell me, Argax, what must I do? Find a wish that will take you back to your world. After a long silence, Bastian asked, Argax, can you tell me how many wishes I have left? Not very many. In my opinion, 3 or 4 at the most. And that will hardly be enough. You're beginning rather late, and the way back isn't easy. You'll have to cross the Sea of Mist. That alone will cost you a wish. What comes next, I don't know. No one in Fantastica knows what road you people must take to get back to your world. Maybe you'll find yours, Minrude. That's the last hope for people like you. But I'm afraid that for you, it's, in a manner of speaking, too far. Be that as it may, you will, just this once, find your way out of the city of the old emperors. Thanks, Argax, said Bastian. The little gray monkey grinned. Goodbye, Bastian Balthazar Bucks. With one leap, Argax vanished into one of the crazy houses. He had taken Bastian's turban with him. For a while, Bastian stood motionless. He was so stunned by what he had just heard that he couldn't decide what to do. All his plans had collapsed at one stroke. His thoughts seemed to have been stood on end, like the pyramid he had seen. What he had hoped was his ruin, and what he had feared his salvation. At the moment, only one thing was clear to him. He must get out of this insane city and never come back. He started through the jumble of crazy buildings. He soon discovered that it was much harder to get out than to get in. Time and time again he lost his way and found himself back in the center of the city. It took him all afternoon to reach the earthworks. Then he ran out into the heath and kept going until black night, as black as the night before, forced him to stop. Exhausted, he collapsed under a juniper tree and fell into a deep sleep. And while he slept, the memory that he could once make up stories left him. All night, he had the same unchanging vision before his eyes. Atreyu, with the gaping wound in his chest, stood there looking at him in silence. Awakened by a thunderclap, Bastian started up. Deep darkness lay all around him, but the massive clouds that had been gathering for days had been thrown into wild disorder. Lightning flashed, thunder shook the earth, the storm wind howled over the heath, and the juniper trees were bowed to the ground. Rain fell in dense sheets. Bastian arose and stood there, wrapped in his black mantle. The water ran down his face. Lightning struck a tree directly in front of him and split the gnarled trunk. The branches went up in flames. The wind blew a shower of sparks over the heath. In a moment, they were doused by the rain. The crash had thrown Bastian to his knees. He dug into the earth with both hands. When the hole was big enough, he unslung the sword Secanda and put it in. Secanda, he said, I am taking leave of you forever. Never again shall anyone draw you against a friend. No one shall find you here until what you and I have done is forgotten. He filled in the hole and covered it over with moss and branches, lest anyone should discover it. And there, Secanda lies to this day. For not until far in the future will one come who can wield it without danger. But that is another story, and shall be told another time. Bastian went his way through the darkness. Toward morning the storm abated, the wind died down, and there was no other sound than the rain dripping from the trees. That night was the beginning of a long, lonely journey for Bastian. He no longer wished to return to his traveling companions or Zaid. Now he wanted to find the way back to the human world, but he didn't know how or where to look for it. Was there somewhere a gate, a bridge, a mountain pass that would take him back? He had to wish for it, that he knew. But he had no power over his wishes. He felt like a diver who is searching the bottom of the sea for a sunken ship, but keeps being driven to the surface before he can find anything. He also knew that he had few wishes left, so he was careful not to use Auron. He was determined to sacrifice his last few remaining memories, only if he felt sure that this would help him get back to his world. But wishes cannot be summoned up or kept away at will. They come from deeper within us than good or bad intentions, and they spring up unannounced. And so, before he knew it, a new wish arose within him and little by little took form. For days and nights he had been wandering all alone, and because of being alone, he yearned to belong to some sort of community, to be taken into a group, not as a master or victor or as any special sort of person, but merely as one among many, perhaps as the smallest or least important, provided his membership in the community was unquestioned. And then one day, he came to a seacoast, or so he thought at first. He was standing on the edge of a sheer cliff, and before him lay a sea of congealed white waves. It was some time before he realized that these waves were not really motionless, but were moving very slowly, that there were currents and eddies that moved as imperceptibly as the hands of a clock. He had come to the Sea of Mist. Bastian walked along the cliff. The air was warm and slightly damp. There was not the slightest breeze. It was early morning, and the sun shone on the snow-white surface of the fog, which extended to the horizon. He walked for several hours. Toward noon, he espied a small town some distance from the shore. Supported by piles, it formed a sort of island in the Sea of Mist. The long, arching bridge, connecting the town with the rocky coast, swayed gently as Bastian crossed it. The houses were relatively small. The doors, windows, and stairways all seemed to have been made for children, and indeed, the people moving about the streets were no bigger than children, though they all seemed to be grown men with beards, or women with pinned-up hair. As Bastian soon noticed, these people looked so much alike that he could hardly tell them apart. Their faces were dark brown, like moist earth, and they looked calm and gentle. When they saw Bastian, they nodded to him, but none spoke. Altogether, they seemed a silent lot. The place was humming with activity, yet he seldom heard a cry or a spoken word, and never did he see any of these people alone. They always went about in groups, if not in crowds, locking arms or holding one another by the hand. When Bastian examined the houses more closely, he saw that they were all made of a sort of wicker, some crude and some of a finer weave, and that the streets were paved with the same kind of material. Even the people's clothing, he noticed. Their trousers, skirts, jackets, and hats were of wickerwork, though these were artfully woven. Everything in the town seemed to be made of the same material. Here and there, Bastian was able to cast a glance into the artisans' workshops. They were all busy weaving, making shoes, pitchers, lamps, cups, and umbrellas of wickerwork. But never did he see anyone working alone, for these things could be made only by several persons working together. It was a pleasure to see how cleverly they coordinated their movements. And as they worked, They usually sang some simple melody without words. The town was not very large, and Bastian had soon come to the edge of it. There he saw hundreds of ships of every size and shape. The town was a seaport, but of a most unusual kind, for all these ships were hanging from gigantic fishing poles and hovered, swaying gently, over a chasm full of swirling white mist. These ships, made of wickerwork like everything else, had neither sails nor masts nor oars nor rudders. Bastian leaned over the railing and looked down into the sea of mist. He was able to gauge the length of the stakes supporting the town by the shadows they cast on the white surface below. At night, he heard a voice beside him say, "The mists rise to the level of the town, then we can put out to sea. In the daytime the sun reduces the mist, and the level falls. That's what you wanted to know, isn't it, stranger?" 3 men were leaning against the railing beside Bastian. They seemed gentle and friendly. They got to talking, and in the course of his conversation with them, Bastian learned that the town was called Iskal or Basketville. Its inhabitants were known as Iskalnari. The word meant roughly the partners. The 3 were mist sailors. Not wishing to give his name for fear of being recognized, Bastian introduced himself as someone. The 3 sailors told him the Iskalnari had no names for individuals and didn't find it necessary. They were all Iskalnari, and that was enough for them. Since it was lunchtime, they invited Bastian to join them, and he gratefully accepted. They went to a nearby inn, and during the meal, Bastian learned all about Basketville and its inhabitants. The Sea of Mist, which they called the Skyden, was an enormous ocean of white vapor which divided the 2 parts of Fantastica from each other. No one had ever found out how deep the Skyden was, or where all this mist came from. It was quite possible to breathe below the surface of the mist, and to walk some distance on the bottom of the sea near the coast, where the mist was relatively shallow, but only if one was tied to a rope and could be pulled back. For the mist had one strange property: it fuddled one's sense of direction. Any number of fools and daredevils had died in the attempt to cross the Skaden alone and on foot. Only a few had been rescued. The only way to reach the other side was in the ships of the Yiskalnari. The wickerwork from which the houses, implements, clothing, and ships of Iskal were made was woven from a variety of rushes that grew under the surface of the sea not far from the shore. These rushes, as can easily be gathered from the foregoing, could be cut only at the risk of one's life. Though unusually pliable and even limp in ordinary air, they stood upright in the sea because they were lighter than the mist. That was what made the wickerwork ships mist-worthy. And if any of the Iskalnari chanced to fall into the mist, his regular clothing served the purpose of a life jacket. But the strangest thing about the Iskalnari, so it struck Bastian, was that the word "I" seemed unknown to them. In any case, they never used it, but in speaking of what they thought or did, always said "we." When he gathered from the conversation that the 3 sailors would be putting out to sea that night, he asked if he could ship with them as a cabin boy. They informed him that a voyage on the Skaden was very different from any other ocean voyage, because no one knew how long it would take or exactly where it would end up. When Bastian said that didn't worry him, they agreed to take him on. At nightfall, the mists began to rise, and by midnight they had reached the level of Basketville. The ships that had been dangling in midair were now floating on the white surface. The moorings of the one on which Bastian found himself, a flat barge about 100 feet long, were cast off, and it drifted slowly out into the sea of mist. The moment he laid his eyes on it, Bastian wondered what propelled this sort of ship, since it had neither sails nor oars nor propeller. He soon found out that sails would have been useless, for there was seldom any wind on the Skaden, and that oars and propellers do not function in mist. These ships were moved by an entirely different sort of power. In the middle of the deck, there was a round, slightly raised platform. Bastian had noticed it from the start and taken it for a sort of captain's bridge. Indeed, it was occupied throughout the voyage by 2 or more sailors. The entire crew numbered 14. The men on the platform held one another clasped by the shoulders and looked fixedly forward. At first sight, they seemed to be standing motionless. Actually, they were swaying very slowly, in perfect unison, in a sort of dance, which they accompanied by chanting over and over again a simple and strangely beautiful tune. At first, Bastian regarded this song and dance as some sort of ceremony, the meaning of which escaped him. Then, on the 3rd day of voyage, he asked one of his 3 friends about it. Evidently surprised at Bastian's ignorance, the sailor explained that those men were propelling the ship by thought power. More puzzled than ever, Bastian asked if some sort of hidden wheels were set in motion. No, one of the sailors replied. When you want to move your legs, you have only to think about it. You don't need wheels, do you? The only difference between a person's body and a ship was that to move a ship at least 2, Iskalnari had to merge their thought powers into one. It was this fusion of thought powers that propelled the ship. If greater speed was desired, more men had to join in. Normally, thinkers worked in shifts of 3. The others rested, for easy and pleasant as it looked, thought propulsion was hard work, demanding intense and unbroken concentration, but there was no other way of sailing the Skaden. Bastian became the student of the mist navigators and learned the secret of their cooperation, dance and song without words. Little by little, in the course of the long voyage, he became one of them. During the dance, he felt his thought power merging with those of his companions to form a whole, and this gave him a strange and indescribable sense of harmony and self-forgetfulness. He felt accepted by a community, at one with his companions, and at the same time he totally forgot that the inhabitants of the world from which he came, and to which he was seeking the way back, were human beings, each with his own thoughts and opinions. Dimly, he remembered his home and parents, but nothing more. His wish to be no longer alone had come true. But now, deep in his heart, a new wish arose and began to make itself felt. One day it struck him that the Iskalnari lived together so harmoniously, not because they blended different ways of thinking, but because they were so much alike that it cost them no effort to form a community. Indeed, they were incapable of quarreling or even disagreeing, because they did not regard themselves as individuals. Thus, there were no conflicts or differences to overcome, and it was just this sameness, this absence of stress that gradually came to pall on Bastian. Their gentleness bored him, and the unchanging melody of their songs got on his nerves. He felt that something was lacking, something he hungered for, but he could not yet have said what it was. This became clear to him some time later when a giant mist crow was sighted. Stricken with terror, the sailors vanished below deck as fast as they could, but one was not quick enough, The monstrous bird swooped down with a cry, seized the poor fellow, and carried him away in its beak. When the danger was past, the sailors emerged and resumed their song and dance as though nothing had happened. Their harmony was undisturbed, and far from grieving, they didn't waste so much as a word on the incident. "Why should we grieve?" said one of them when Bastian inquired. "None of us is missing." With them, the individual counted for nothing. No one was irreplaceable, because they drew no distinction between one man and another. Bastian, however, wanted to be an individual, a someone, not just one among others. He wanted to be loved for being just what he was. In this community of Iskalnari, there was harmony, but no love. He no longer wanted to be the greatest, strongest, or cleverest. He had left all that far behind. He longed to be loved just as he was, good or bad, handsome or ugly, clever or stupid, with all his faults, or possibly because of them. But what was he actually like? He no longer knew. So much had been given to him in Fantastica, and now, among all these gifts and powers, he could no longer find himself. He stopped dancing with the mist sailors. All day long, and sometimes all night as well, he sat in the prow, looking out over the Skaden. At last, the crossing was completed, and the mist ship docked. Bastian thanked the Iskalnari and went ashore. This was a land full of roses. There were whole forests of roses of every imaginable color. A winding path led through the endless rose garden, and Bastian followed it. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. I hope this story has brought you a little peace and relaxation. As always, feel free to drift off whenever you're ready. I'll be here next time with another tale to help guide you into a restful sleep. Until then, take care and sweet dreams.